Hi, welcome to week 4. My name is Nicole Maceira Cumming, and this week we will be discussing Unto the Pure, All Things Are Pure, Animal Flesh and the Reformation. The Protestant Reformation took place across the British Isles during the 16th century and had a wide-ranging impact on society and culture. Henry VIII made a break with the Catholic Church in 1534, bringing England under royal rather than papal authority. The reign of Mary I saw this reversed, but with the exception of her 5 years of rule, England became a Protestant nation. Scotland's relationship to the Reformation was markedly different, in that it was not decided by royal authority, and rather emerged through a political shift led by a number of the nobility and supported by religious preachers such as John Knox. This lecture today will focus on two key ideas that emerged in Protestant thinking with regards to diet. Firstly, that Catholic fast days were understood to be papist errors, and secondly, that the consumption of animal flesh was heralded as a God-given gift to humanity. The choice of the term animal flesh here is intentional, as the term meat referred to food more widely in the early modern period. However, for ease of language, I will revert to using the term meat in its modern sense from this point onwards. I hope today to provide an introduction to fast days before and after the Reformation, highlighting the changes that took place, and to provide an overview of the religious ideas that surrounded the consumption of meat. The relationship between the late medieval and early modern Catholic Church and meat consumption was not always clear, but it did warrant a lot of attention from theologians. Fast days were common practice in Catholic Britain, with Fridays being official fish days and religious observances such as Lent traditionally requiring abstinence from meat. Abstinence was a central debate that surrounded meat consumption, but it was one that varied in the values that were attributed to it. Meat was believed, in medical terms, to generate the humours of heat and moisture, which were believed to combat impotence and to actively produce blood and semen. It was therefore often argued that the diet of monks should exclude meat. Until the 11th century, monastic communities in particular tended to distance themselves from what they saw as the gluttony of the social elite, and abstinence was practiced as a mark of piety. Yet by the 15th century, there are clear signs that such abstinence was not a requirement, certainly not on the part of high-ranking church members. On the 28th of September 1465, 6,000 guests attended the great feast at the enthronement of the Archbishop of York, George Neville. George Neville was the fifth son of the Earl of Salisbury, who not only had royal blood through 3 familial lines, but was also connected to most of the other noble houses of England through marriage. The guest list reads as a who's who of 16th century England, and at the high table alone sat 2 royal dukes, 2 earls and 3 bishops, with the second table being made up of 31 heads of religious houses. The guest list is undoubtedly impressive, but what is even more revealing is the menu. As you can see from the extract, it included 12 porpoises and seals, 1,000 mutton, 6 wild bulls, 500 stags and does, 4,000 pigeons, and 400 swans. This extravagant feast clearly includes meat, but it goes beyond this. The array of animals being consumed is a deliberate display of power and wealth. It would appear that the behaviour of elite church members were often aligned with those of the wider nobility, and that the piety of abstinence was not recognised by all. As well as emulation of the nobility, we can trace some fun medieval get-arounds for consuming meat on prescribed fish days. The barnacle goose myth reveals an inventive and frankly absurd means by which Catholics might consume meat on days where it was prohibited. Leo of Rosmitzel, a Bohemian nobleman, visited England from 1465 to 67, and his secretary set down a bemused account of a fast day dinner in Salisbury upon the invite of the Duke of Clarence. He sat down to, quote, eat what should have been a fish, but it was roasted and looked like a duck. It was of course a bird, it was the barnacle goose. The image shown is taken from a medieval bestiary, or Book of Beasts. It shows the barnacles hanging from what appears to be an underwater plant, looking a bit like both a barnacle and a goose. The idea that the barnacle goose hatched from a barnacle was used to help to explain the disappearance of the geese at certain times of year, which we now know to be due to migration. This possibility was then further strengthened by the supposed similarity of the tulip-shaped shell to the goose itself. The earliest and most notable record of this myth is in Gerald of Wales's 1187 Topographa Hiberniae, a historical account of Ireland. Gerald of Wales, an archdeacon and historian, wrote that there are likewise here many birds called barnacles, being at first gummy excrescences from pine beams floating on the waters, and then enclosed in shells to secure other free growth. They hang by their beaks like seaweeds to timber. Being in process of time well covered with feathers, they either fall into the water or take their flight in the free air, their nourishment and growth being supplied, while they are bred in this very unaccountable and curious manner from the juices of the wood in the sea-water. I have often seen with my own eyes more than 1,000 minute embryos of birds of this species on the seashore, hanging from one piece of timber covered with shells and already formed. No eggs are laid by these birds, hence in some parts of Ireland bishops and men of religion make no scruple of eating these birds on fasting days, as not being flesh because they are not born of the flesh. It should be noted that while this myth persisted into the early modern period, there had been scepticism from as early as the 12th century. It is therefore possible that the perseverance of this myth was linked to its benefits in avoiding fast days. There is limited evidence for how far fast days were followed in pre-Reformation Britain, and as the examples of elite behaviour and get-arounds demonstrate, the prescription to abstain from meat was not always followed. But what we do know is that fast days were a common and well understood feature of Christian life. This leads us to the second half of the lecture, looking at the Reformation and Protestant understandings of both meat consumption and fasting. The two scriptural passages that you see here are commonly evoked by Reformed theologians in reference to Catholic fasting practices and the scriptural precedent to consume animals. Both passages are taken from books of the Bible attributed to St. Paul, and this is tied to the Reformed focus on Pauline scripture. The Mosaic laws of the Old Testament that required abstinence from unclean beasts were often emphasised by Protestant theologians, who made clear that these laws were no longer applicable for Christians. For John Calvin, the Swiss reformer and an influential theologian for the Reformation in both England and Scotland, the only command which should be followed with regards to the consumption of animals was the one given by Paul in Corinthians 1:10-31. Eating and drinking is to be done in the glory of God. This passage is understood to confirm that the notion of an unclean beast is false, and therefore any laws of fasting or abstinence go against God. In a sermon, Calvin takes this idea further, stating that those who deny God's gifts are monsters of nature. John Weems, a Scottish theologian, appealed to the words of Paul in Titus 1:15, "To the clean all things are clean." Weems's interpretation is very similar to Calvin's and emphasises the significance of Pauline doctrine on Protestant understandings of dietary laws. Weems also adds that men must not act like the Pythagoreans who thought it unlawful to kill any beast or fowl. The reference here to Pythagoras, the Greek philosopher, points to his association with the vegetarian diet. Such a diet was presented as an affront to God by Protestants, since God was understood to have provided animals as food for men. The Book of Common Order, the official directory of public worship of the Scottish Church from 1560 onwards, stated that, quote, "By the mouth of thine apostle, to the clean all things are clean," confirming that fasting and abstinence from certain foods were understood as an unlawful practice and an affront to God. As the Scottish theologian George Hutcheson wrote in the 17th century, God gave man dominion over his fellow creatures so that he may kill and destroy beasts, birds, and fishes for his meat. In other words, the consumption of meat was a God-given right, and abstinence was seen as a disregard for the gift that the Lord had provided. Alongside this clear stance on the lawfulness of eating any and all meat, Protestants understood Catholic fast days to have been vanity and idolatrous. The first book of discipline, penned by the First General Assembly of the Scottish Reformed Church, explicitly abolished any superstitious observation of fasting days alongside holy days and all other papist inventions. This was later reinforced by the General Assembly in 1575. The abolishment of holy days was reiterated here, and the Assembly included a decree to enforce civil penalties for all practices such as fasting and other vanities. These declarations make clear that Catholic fasting practices were no longer allowed. Presumably, this would have presented a recognisable change in the consumption of animal products amongst the clergy and possibly amongst the wider population. However, the reality of this shift is more complicated. The English theologian Thomas Beacon wrote a fruitful treatise of fasting in 1550, in which he writes that, quote, "The abuse of fasting in the Pope's kingdom was very wicked and worthy to be abhorred of." However, the treatise is not solely an attack on Catholic fasting, it is in fact a guide on how to fast correctly. In a similar vein, the Book of Common Order, in spite of its declaration against papistical fasting, contained a treatise for fasting that sets out to explain the distinction between Catholic fasting practices and the public fasting that the Scottish Kirk embraced. Margot Todd and Alec Ryrie have emphasised the popularity of public fasting in Scotland after the Reformation. It was designed to be a response to divine communication, and so was understood to be sacred since it was initiated by divine activity. For example, fasts were to be prescribed during periods of famine, bad weather, or unrest. However, predictable fasting seasons also emerged over time, mainly in the harvest period and also at traditional times such as Lent. Todd provides examples of fines for eating meat in air, where a first offence would involve a 40-shilling fine, a second offence a £4 fine, and a third £6, a substantial sum for the period that reflects how fasting practices were still understood to be important. Proclamations in both England and Scotland confirm that there was a desire to maintain fasting in spite of the criticisms that were levelled against Catholic practices. Queen Elizabeth I of England issued a proclamation in 1558, commanding that all manner of persons, of what condition soever they be, should abstain from killing, dressing, or eating of any flesh upon all such usual fasting days. And in 1568, a further proclamation was issued for the keeping of fish days. It was stated here that any offenders should be punished by law. Elizabeth was not the only Protestant authority to reissue such proclamations. In Scotland, similar proclamations were made by the Regency government in James VI's minority, and later by James VI of Scotland himself. The records of the Privy Council of Scotland, the body that advised the monarch, reveal several proclamations concerning Lent. In 1567, a proclamation was issued that no one should eat any manner of flesh during the time of this present Lent, nor in any time coming during the season of the year, nor that any butchers, hosts, cooks, or innkeepers kill or prepare any manner of flesh to be sold in the said time. It also emphasises that the ban on consuming flesh in this season is a protection against famine. Extracts from 1574, 1579 and 1586 reinstate this prohibition against eating meat at Lent, unless a certificate is given to excuse someone from this rule due to age, sickness or infirmity. The 1573 record also makes it clear that the rules have not been followed. It reads that, as a result of past troubles and the insolence and fragility of various kinds of people, the law has been disregarded and plainly violated in previous years, and this is said to be likely to continue if a solution is not found. The 1586 declaration not only prohibited meat on Lent, but also on Wednesdays, Fridays and Saturdays. There was a clear demand for fasting to be adhered to by the population, and there's a strong possibility that there were both religious and secular reasons for this. Fish days were said to have continued in England in order to safeguard the fishing economy, since it was assumed that nobody would eat fish by choice. During times of shortage and famine, there was often a need to restrict certain foods. In fact, in 1591, the eating of meat during Lent was prohibited in Scotland due to an ongoing famine and a lack of fish, which are acknowledged in the proclamation. It is also clear that economic and religious reasons were not the only factors that might influence decisions on fasting. In 1599, a proclamation was made that meat could be eaten at Lent from the 15th of April onwards due to the baptism of the King's daughter, Margaret Stuart. This walk through the timeline of both English and Scottish Lent and fast day proclamations complicates our understanding of how fasting was understood after the Reformation. It is clear that it continued to hold significance, and that in spite of the declarations against Catholic fasting practices, Lent and other observations continued to be made. But it is also clear that these were flexible arrangements that were just as shaped by economic and social concerns as they were by religious ones. As for before the Reformation, it can be hard to determine how closely these practices were adhered to, but there is clear evidence that religious fasts that involved abstinence from meat continued into the 18th century in Britain. Hannah Woolley's 1670 household book for ladies and gentlewomen, named The Queenlike Closet, contains a wide array of recipes and guidance on etiquette. It includes a menu for fish days and fasting days that excludes meat. Woolley notes that it would be most likely used in Ember Week or in Lent. There clearly remained a demand for guidance on meat-free menus for certain religious observances such as Lent. However, it does appear that by this period it was less likely for weekly fasting to have been observed. The Protestant continuation of fasting, albeit fasting that was understood to be different to Catholic practice, suggests that for the wider population in early modern Britain, there would have been very little change in the immediate period after the Reformation. Of course, there is always a strong possibility that not everyone followed these rules in the first place. But it is clear that fish days and Lent observances continued to be held, and that Christian fasting maintained an important role throughout medieval and early modern Britain. However, after the Reformation, it is clear that the consumption of animal flesh was understood as a God-given right. There was no room, as there had been in the medieval period, for the clergy or wider population to practice abstinence as a mark of piety. The idea of abstinence became connected to ideas of idolatry and papism, and was seen as a disregard for the gifts that God had provided. After the Reformation, dietary practices were shaped by a Protestant identity. The words of Paul that to the pure all things were pure meant that a diet including meat was one that respected God's creation. Abstinence from meat was still practiced for fasts, but the reasons behind this abstinence shifted over time and became more secular. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to discussing the topic further in Friday's question and answer session.